Hello friends, a very good evening. This is Winky. Welcome to my channel Winky's World. It really feels nice to come back to you with my first video on the subject of the Indian Constitution as I have promised during my introductory video. In this first video on the subject of Indian Constitution, I am going to explain to you as to why it is important to understand the legacy of the national movement, to have a basic idea of the framework of the Indian Constitution and why Indian democracy has been relatively successful. We know that we had been under Britishers' rule for 200 long years. We were subjected to various forms of discrimination and exploitation. Throughout their rule, the colonial rulers consciously and consistently pursued a policy of divide and rule to keep the Indian sections from being united against the colonial empire. Of course, that sowed the seeds of communalism and eventually resulted into painful partition of the country. When India became free in 1947, Britishers left behind a thoroughly messed up India with grossly underdeveloped economy, total illiteracy, and deep-rooted social inequalities. The Western critics strongly believed that and openly expressed the view that democracy was not suited for a diverse country like India, and if they had wanted to keep the country together, to keep the nation united, authoritarian style of government was more suited because of the very nature of the people, a heterogeneous group of people. But our visionary leadership had a different idea. They were confident that India could successfully operate a democratic political system. So the visionary leadership, the leadership which spearheaded the independence movement, actually voted for democratic political system and parliamentary system of government based on universal adult franchise. But the Western skeptics and critics openly made predictions that Indian democracy would soon collapse and would have to be replaced by an authoritarian style of government because India was essentially a heterogeneous country. Their line of thinking was that Indian society was not homogeneous and was characterized by multiplicity of languages, castes, religions, ethnicities, cultures, and in such a heterogeneous country, democracy would not survive. Essentially, their line of thinking was that India was a country with multiplicity of languages, castes, religions, ethnicities, etc. The identification of people with their own culture, with their own localized cultures, was way more stronger than their emotional identification with country as a nation. To their mind, India was a very unnatural nation. Of course, that kind of pessimistic attitude was essentially a hangover of the British colonial ideology. During their rule, the Britishers consciously and consistently propagated the notion that India was unfit for democracy for various historical, geographical, and socio-cultural reasons, and only benevolent despotism was suited to rule a country like India. And another reason put forward by the Western critics was that for a democracy to survive, a minimum level of economic development and literacy were essential. But 200 long years of subjugation to colonial rule meant that India inherited a thoroughly underdeveloped and ruined economy. The basic infrastructure facilities required for the growth of the economy were abysmally inadequate. As for literacy, the less said about it, the better, because there was near total illiteracy among the masses. Not only that, the newly independent India was confronted with other equally daunting challenges. Maybe it may not be possible to give you an exhaustive list of the problems, but some of the important problems India was confronted with were the wounds of partition were still fresh in the minds of the people, and there was a general atmosphere of bitterness between Hindus and Muslims, and there was the problem of religious fundamentalism, and Indian society was characterized by deep-rooted socio-economic inequalities and caste-based oppression. And there was the problem of gender discrimination and the problem of secessionism. And another problem was that we had to inherit a bureaucratic administrative apparatus with colonial attitudes. When the country launched a program of economic development, the bureaucracy we inherited turned out to be largely unresponsive to the needs, developmental needs of the country. So, such was the sorrow state of affairs, sad state of affairs when India emerged as an independent nation. But in spite of all those problems, in spite of all those predictions made by the Western skeptics that the democracy of India was least likely to survive, India has been able to deal with all those challenges in a more or less successful manner. And today, we are into the 75th year of independence. India is now one of the largest democracies and is a thriving democracy, a very mature democracy, because it would not have been possible without the dynamic nature of the Indian constitution. One of the most important reasons was for the success of India's democracy was that we were fortunate enough to inherit a well thought out and one of the most liberal constitutional documents in the world. In course of time, Indian constitution has proved itself to be one of the most egalitarian, dynamic and organic documents which is capable of being adapted to the changing socio-economic and political needs of the country. But such an egalitarian, well designed, and well thought out liberal constitutional document was by no means a sudden development, nor was it entirely the product of the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly. The Indian Constitution is essentially an embodiment of the values, principles, ideals, and ideologies that the national movement stood for throughout its fight against the colonial rule. We can even go as far as to say that the very idea of India as a nation in the modern sense of the word was conceived during the process of our freedom struggle. Former Vice President Sri Hamid Ansari, speaking at an event, rightly said, Independent India is a faithful reflection of the legacy of our national movement. So, in that sense, I personally feel that it is very important to understand the legacy of the national movement if we want to have a basic idea of the framework of the Indian Constitution and why the Indian Constitution is what it is and why the Indian democracy has been largely successful. You see, for example, let us take, for example, the democracies of Pakistan and Myanmar. Both the countries became independent around the same time. If you take, for example, the case of Myanmar, as well Burma, you know, if you are aware of the developments happening there, most of the democratic leaders have been jailed, have been house arrested, and it is now being ruled by an authoritarian military regime. And as for Pakistan, even the democratically elected government cannot go against the wishes of the military on a matter of foreign policy. And most of the times, when the democratically elected leader of Pakistan makes a state visit, for example, to America, he is usually accompanied by his military chief. Such things cannot happen in India. Such things are even unthinkable in India because such is the maturity of Indian democracy. And also, to if you understand the national legacy, legacy of the national movement properly, you can also understand the debates and discussions happening in India on matters concerning socio-economic and political development of the country. And you have the habit of regularly following the daily newspapers and going through the articles or essays on matters of constitutional importance, you will notice that such articles or essays contain references to the legacy or ideology of the national movement. I'll give you a latest example. It is an article on the independence of the judiciary. It is today's newspaper. And here is a sentence. It is just an example. For our founding fathers, founding fathers for the leadership of the national movement, an independent judiciary was non-negotiable. The point that I'm trying to make here is this. For you to understand the current issues of constitutional and political importance, it is important that you have a basic idea of the legacy of the national movement. So, from that standpoint, I am going to make a few videos on the legacy of the national movement from the standpoint of the Indian Constitution and democracy. In the next video, I am going to talk about how the leadership of the national movement went about a rather complex task of forging a national identity in a country as diverse as India, and what was the strategy and how it got reflected in the Indian Constitution, and how that strategy immensely helped in preserving the unity of the country. So with this, I will conclude this video. Friends, if you like this video, I request you to hit the subscribe button. Thank you friends. Have a good day.